welcome back to the lecture series on partition of India in print media and cinema. So, we are already discussing the concept of refugee and the idea of how a refugee. So, we are discussing who is a refugee and the process of journeying from one's state of refuginess and becoming a citizen. And we are discussing the idea of refugee vis-a-vis the concept of Desh and nation. We have to understand that Desh and nation are not always interchangeable terms. Desh is a word used in different Indian language that would be translated to English as nation. However, in the context of partition of India, Desh is associated with a sense of nostalgia. It means one's homeland, and so it may not always overlap with and be considered as synonymous with the idea of nation, because post-colonial nation state in the case of in the South Asian context, as we see, is an operation, is an implementation from above, a decision or a redrawing of the cartography of the borders by the politicians, the enactors of the anti-colonial movements, as we have been discussing in our previous lectures. And so, once Desh is the land of the ancestors, Desh is kind of one associates a natural belonging with a Desh, whereas a nation is shaping of a social group or community in terms of a people, a given people's common language, common ethnicity, and above all one's common religious community. So, this is to say that nation is a kind of redrawing of the borders and bringing a people together in terms of their common language, ethnicity, and religious identity. So, we have to understand that refugees, whenever a homogeneous people, the refugee as a social marker is never a homogeneous identity, and we see that in transit camps as well as in the colonies, in the permanent refugee housing colonies, there was hardly a leveling or a kind of casteless, classless grouping or cohabitance among the refugee people. So, we see that the refugee housing colonies would maintain the caste, geographical, class based and gender based differences. So, Ravinder Kaur notes how citizenship conceptualized a set of self-constituting practices in different contexts and different settings of power, such that power would enable self-making and power would induce being made. So, basically a successful refugee is in charge of a certain social, economic, cultural capital. So, they power makes the refugee, and the refugee in turn is able to generate power. That is the notion of a successful refugee that has assimilated himself as a citizen in the host land. So, the idea of a successful refugee is someone that is produced by the system of power, by different systems of power, by the different networkings, and in turn is an agent himself who is in charge, who can, who is in control, in charge, and who is basically enables self-making and making of power. So, Anindita Ghoshal notes how the social marker refugee has until a recent time been perceived as a monolithic group. So, we have not understood the refugee experience in terms of an individual's class, caste, linguistic and ethnic positions. However, all these dimensions actually speak to and determine, they in a way color one's experience, one's way of being a refugee. So, so the categorizations of refugees were made either as a political or economic bloc or a religious community. So, when we look at the refugee as a monolithic case, a homogeneous identity, we negate the complexity of their compositions and also the historical contexts of their locations. Under what circumstances they became refugees, what external and internal factors influence their experience of refugeehood. So, until a long time, until recently, so it is only in the recent past that scholarship has taken into consideration the problem of regionalization, and it starts pondering on the idea of multiple layers within the identity of refugees. And so, this is something we need to look at, how what historical circumstance actually creates the refugee. So, Uditi Sen notes that the post-war international order of nation states seeks to organize populations into nation groups, and each of which have their own sovereign state or homeland. So, one could argue that the modern refugee is a product of the world, where the ground realities are different from how so the ground realities are different from how we envision the nation as an ideal. So, as ground realities, we have multi-ethnic societies, there are contradictions, there are different political ideas, and yet in an ideal nation, it is imagined that there would be seamless congruence between the territory and population encompassed by the state, such that the population, the mental scape of the population and that of the political community of a nation actually converge, and there is no problematic relationship between the two. That is something we imagine, but that is the ideal imagination of the nation, and it is far different from the ground realities. So, we have already talked about how refugee as a category is essentially the able-bodied male. So, in the definitions of the displaced person, the way we understand the legal language or the bureaucratic language that is used in the official parlance, in the official version, the refugee is an able-bodied male. And in thinking in that way, we in a way we cast or we position the woman, the disabled, the juvenile, the infirm individuals towards the fringes of the rehabilitation process. So, this is also because a refugee is always welcome into a nation only or majorly when he can self-rehabilitate himself, take charge of himself and his dependents without much help from the nation. And so such a person is not seen as an economic abuser and in fact seen as an asset to the nation. So, by the same logic, the others or the others, the women, the disabled, that would not be able to establish themselves without state incentives are are relegated towards the peripheries, towards the fringes of the rehabilitation process. So, the resettlement policies were largely shaped to cater to the needs of the ideal refugee. So, the ideal refugee represents a category that would comprise professions such as government officers, traders, businessmen and other white collar jobs. So, these people, this section of the population, refugee population, was economically secure, they were politically astute and they were entrenched with social networks. In other words, their process of resettlement was smoother and did not seek help from the government. So, nation building as a process, when we look at it, how is a nation built? It ensures that the hegemony of the majority of the population, the way the majority of the population think and exists is not challenged. So, the majoritarian existence constitutes the nation, and in an ideal nation, in a smooth running nation, such a majoritarian way of being, way of living would not be challenged. So, the creation of nation automatically requires any nation, the nation as an entity in order to be stable requires constant shedding of people that do not fit into this constructed identity or someone that problematizes, unsettles this framework which is endorsed by the majority of its denizens. So, one could say that a nation is the category of nation, the entity of nation can be secured through a systematic process of minority persecution, ethnic cleansing, denial of political rights to smaller groups. So, all these basically ensure that a nation can function in a smooth manner. And this in turn leads to, this in turn motivate, these factors motivate or in fact force people to evacuate and to move to other lands in search of greater security. So, how is a refugee created is a question that is closely associated with the formation of nation, the process through which a nation is formed. The people that do not fit into a particular nation building process have to eventually evacuate and so that is how there is exodus of the persecuted, there is exodus of the persecuted constantly taking place. So, displacement can take multiple forms. It could be the internal refugees, it could be as a result of rejection, eviction, there could be asylum seekers and so on. What happens to the refugee community? The community of the exodus people, like a community of people that have emigrated from another part from another nation and resettle in a new one. What happens to these people that have emigrated from another nation and resettled in a new one? They, the minorities have this tendency, this process is actually a pattern where one observes the minorities trying to construct a national identity and striving to build a majority for themselves. Uh, so, within one nation, there is this endeavor, this constant struggle and desire to build sub-national identities within one nation space. So, Ravinder Kaur talks about the refugee card, how the refugee card would have different significance for different refugees depending on their class, caste belonging. So, for the elite immigrants that had that could easily transcend their refuginess, the card was rendered defunct, and it only had a historical value, and in fact the socio economically well off section of refugees, the affluent refugees, were ashamed in fact of showing the refugee card publicly to others. They were ashamed of showing it publicly to others. So, it was an uncomfortable reminder of an inglorious past, and so in the absence of the refugee card would mean that a family has successfully self rehabilitated itself. Contrarily, the card would have a different meaning altogether for the poorer section, for those that had failed to successfully establish themselves in the host country. So, the card needed to be produced before the concerned authorities for seeking support. So, by way of producing the card, one could become claimant to doles, to other different government welfareist schemes. So, for the poorer section of refugees, the refugee card was actually indispensable. So, Uditi Shen says that the idealized visions of citizenship were not new in South Asia. So, we have different ways of understanding and construing citizenship. Multiple ideals and ideas of citizenship coexisted in late colonial and post-colonial India. These ideas would generally not gel with one another. So, we had the notion of Islamic or Muslim belonging, of Hindu homelands, of liberal feminist notion of citizenship, or universal, the liberal feminist vision of universal Indian citizenship that was unmarked by any caste, class, ethnic belonging, and then the colonial understanding of citizenship, which was increasingly becoming irrelevant, the idea of the loyal subject citizen. So, we see that the specific iteration of citizenship in India, whether as legal status, identity, or as social and political rights, has been an area of contestation, something that has been contested and revisited for a long time. So, there is no consensus about this definition or meaning of citizenship. So, recent scholarship on Indian citizenship focuses on this dynamic aspect of citizenship, and it explores how, whenever we are trying to define and actualize who a citizen is, what constitutes citizenry, we have to position our understanding or inform our understanding by contingent histories. So, citizenship cannot be defined ahistorically, and so when we look at history, we find that there is a broad consensus among historians and political scientists that between the period of 1946 and 1956, there was a generative phase that gave birth to a cluster of ideas, rights and legal definitions, all of which could differently constitute the notion of Indian citizenship. We have much scholarship that actually examines the process of the process of the refugees becoming citizen, the journey through which a person becomes a citizen from a refugee. And in fact, in an Indian context, one could say, in a South Asian context, one does not so much become a citizen from a refugee as one remains a paradoxical figure of the citizen refugee or the refugee citizen, both in one, a kind of oxymoron. So, Pipavedi notes how state mechanisms at the time of partition were unprepared for the mass migration, which resulted in displacement of millions of people, uprooting of millions of people, and eventually planned evacuations had started taking place. It was not until some time. So, the states, the newly formed nation states, needed some time to prepare themselves and respond to unprecedented crisis. So, we begin to, when we move away from official response, we see the differential experiences actually, how the case for each group of refugees, like I said, was different. So, the state directed some refugees were directed by the state, they were sponsored by the states, others had to make their own plans. So, they utilized personal networks. So, some utilized personal networks, the refugees with better economic and socio-cultural resources were able to migrate to places of their choice. They could resettle the way they wanted to, they could exchange properties because they had in many cases better social mobility, let us say, because of better education, more awareness. People were more, the elite individuals, the elite populace were more familiar with they were more familiar with the host land, and so they had, or they already had, family, friends and business or professional links in the host land. It would make their process of resettlement easier, so or smoother. So, the process of transition, the process of resettlement would be smoother for them. The presence of pre-existing business or family links not only influenced the destination of migration in the case of the elite refugees, but also assisted the process of acceptance by the local population. Once a person is aware or familiar with the local culture in the host land, it enables their absorption, it expedites, it facilitates the process of their absorption or the process of their assimilation with the local native people. So, there is less conflict and there is less tension in that regard. So, the experience of the elite refugees were quite different in this regard. We could say it was quite different. Now, there is this paradox associated with the upper class migrants, where on the one hand, by virtue of being by virtue of being a part of the refugee historical background, how much ever elite they might be, they couldn't actually dissociate themselves from the common historical background where they had migrated from another land a few generations back. And so, very wrongly, even the upper class people would be conflated with the popular image of the destitute refugee, the miserable image of the refugee, and yet the ground reality was very different for this section, where they had in most cases the upper class refugees could smoothly transit into citizenship, and they had become a part and parcel of the upper echelon of the society. They in fact constituted the upper echelon of the society. This is a paradox that they had to carry all along, where they would frequently be, they would be associated with the popular image of the poor refugee, and yet their experiences, they had a very different past to recount, to narrate. Now, Hoymanti Roy notes how citizenship was the end goal for the refugees as well as for the Indian government, and yet retaining the refugee identity would be considered as a political choice in many cases, because so this was also another paradox that the refugees dealt with. On the one hand, they wanted to be assimilated and treated with the same dignity, with the same sense of legitimacy as the citizen, and yet they would retain the refugee identity, because it was a rich ground for articulating and negotiating demands from the state, from the nation state. So, it would enable the refugee in different ways. It would offer them through such negotiations, through such bargains with the government, the refugee could actually have greater access to the state's resources. So, like I said, the refugee citizen as an entity was, it was a dual entity that was being in a way maintained, being upheld. One would not want to be one at the expense of losing the other aspect. So, one would like to be the citizen and still want to remain or retain the refuginess, let us say the reality of refugeehood, or the historical weight of refugeehood. So, refugee as a term has been traditionally seen as abominable, and yet it engenders, it harbingers the question of right, the question of demanding for agency, for access, and fighting for more power, for struggling for more stability. So, it has so many significances. So, when we look at the refugee as an abominable term, it implies that the migrants were strangers whose resettlement and access to resources depended, so their access to resources depended on the benevolence of the of the native people, of benevolence of the government. So, a lot of refugees argued that Pravashi, the word Pravashi was instead a better term. It means exiled, because partition had exiled people who were originally a part of the undivided subcontinent. So, the term refugee had special economic significances associated with qualifications, which would refer to obtaining, for example, obtaining refugee slips. And so, like I said, shedding this term, shedding this social marker, or disowning this social marker, was not something that all sections of refugees could afford. It would, owning one's refuginess and owning one's refugee slips could provide special benefits, including special quota for education and jobs. So, and however, this patronage had its temporal boundaries. In the case of Bengal, any person arriving from East Pakistan after June 25, 1948 was not entitled to registration as refugees, and they were not eligible for any special assistance which was planned by the government. So, on and after 1950, displaced person acquires a fixed definition. The definition is kind of exclusive, reductive, because any person that does not fit into the definition would automatically not be refugee enough. So, and not be entitled to the benefits offered by the government thereby. So, someone that had arrived on account of communal disturbances after 1st of October 1946 and before 31st December 1950. So, we have this temporal bracketing once again. Any person before and after that is not recognized as refugee enough. And any person arriving between this time and also not having any land in West Bengal and someone that does not intend to return to East Bengal. So, when someone meets all these criteria, such a person fits into the category of displaced person. So, it is a way of ensuring that the displaced person should only have political reasons to move base and not economic incentive to look for greener pastures in India from another abutting country. In 1956, the Indian government introduced migration certificate to control refugees through regulating it as authorized migration. So, migration occupying or obtaining a migration certificate would warrant one's authorized migration. This decision was influenced by the fact that no relief or rehabilitation would be given to people infiltrating in India after 31st March 1958. And after 1958, the Indian state actually adopted the policy of no longer recognizing a new migrant as a refugee. So, we will talk more in this topic, but in our subsequent lectures. Thank you.